The year is sometime in the first half of the last century. The place is somewhere in the developed world. The disaster is one that will be repeated many times over in the coming decades. Let's say it's a flood whose rising waters have not only cut a wide swathe of devastation as homes, businesses and communities are submerged, but also caused death and widespread hopelessness as those affected scramble to higher ground, usually with no more than the clothes on their backs. You're a trained disaster relief helper, perhaps from the army or possibly a member of the region's civil disaster team. You know that your job is to work with a highly specified chain of command to make sure that people are rescued off rooftops and other last resort places to the relative safety of shelters. You're experienced at the logistics of handing out food, water, blankets, and once this is organised, you know that you've done your job well. Now let's fast forward to the current millennium. The place is now anywhere in the world. The disaster is the same, except possibly more devastating in its scope. The communities it affects are just as traumatised, but there is a difference. In the 21st century, there is common understanding among disaster experts and professionals that just because people are safely housed in evacuation centres with food and water and a mat and some blankets, it does not mean that your helping job is finished. In the current disaster scene, you need to know more than rescue and supply logistics. All those continue to be crucial. In today's world, there is a general understanding that the mental health of survivors will be vulnerable. So now you must tend to that level of their well-being as well. You need to be trained in psychological first aid. Hi, my name is Richard Hill. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be talking about a relatively recent phenomenon in the disaster scene, psychological first aid. While this video lecture and the companion video, Core Actions of Psychological First Aid, won't by themselves totally equip you to enter a disaster relief scene, they will introduce you to the core principles and actions of psychological first aid. Here, in the first part, I'll be defining it, identifying its characteristics, and explaining why our modern world demands this level of assistance. After I explain the 5 principles of psychological first aid, we'll see who's at risk of traumatic reaction and who tends to survive better. You might wonder what the symptoms of post-incident stress reaction are, so we'll look at those too. The second part will illustrate through a psychological first aider's experiences in the field the 8 actions that spring from the 5 principles. We'll examine the issues of readiness to enter the field and also look briefly at the 5 competency areas a psychological first aider needs to be able to display in the field. Psychological first aid may be one of the most difficult volunteer jobs you will ever do, but it's heartful work. So put your volunteer cap on. Let's get stuck in. So in trying to get a handle on PFA, psychological first aid, the first question is, what is it? Is what I am calling psychological first aid the same thing that you were thinking of getting involved in? What are its characteristics? Why do we need it? Psychological first aid is a means of providing psychosocial support to individuals and families immediately after a disaster, terrorist or traumatic event, or other emergency. It consists of a set of helping actions which are systematically undertaken in order to reduce initial post-trauma distress and to support short and long-term adaptive functioning. Based on the principle of do no harm, it's provided increasingly by members of the general population, although mental health professionals are almost always involved as well. PFA has 4 characteristics. Well, first of all, it's common sense. Second, it meets basic standards. Third, it's community-based. And fourth, it's designed for field delivery. So, you might be saying a practical, consistent with research approach, which isn't centred in the medical profession and can be practiced at shelters, schools, hospitals, or wherever there are survivors. And that sounds great. Still, why do we need psychological first aid? Well, here's my take on the so what question. Disasters, both natural and human-made, can strike at any time. Sometimes we get a warning, sometimes we do not. It's estimated that being involved in a significant traumatic event, which causes post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, will mean a lifetime of that event continuing to be prevalent for about 61% of men and 51% of women. In a study of 60,000 disaster survivors, between 18 and 21% indicated severe to very severe impairment. Disasters and emergencies are shocking events whose effects can stay with us for a long time, if not a lifetime. And ever since PTSD has been recognised as a disorder in the late 1970s, experts have realised that the psychological well-being of survivors and disaster-affected people needs to be tended to as well as the physical aspects. Most people are resilient enough, say mental health and disaster response experts, that if they are given psychosocial support right after a disruptive event, they will eventually go back to normal without additional specialised mental health intervention. So psychological first aid is helpful as assistance that prevents more serious problems happening later on. Hey, are you curious as to how psychological aid first started? Well, let's look. The need for it was recognised as early as 1922, when the War Office in the United States sought to support its military personnel experiencing combat stress. Those setting up for the programs for the soldiers acknowledged the need for the same 5 elements which have grown into today's psychological first aid. That is, they appreciated that the soldiers needed to be made safe, to be calmed, empowered, connected to loved ones, and instilled with hope. Nevertheless, the main criterion for success of these interventions was not relief of stress symptoms, not syndrome. I mean, certainly that's a syndrome that we have. Rather, it was whether the soldiers could be made functional again, and especially whether they could return to active duty. Given that most disaster survivors whom you would be assisting were not on active combat duty when the disaster struck, your goal in providing first aid would be to help them return to as normal a condition as possible, as soon as possible. So let's look at the principles that will help them to do that. While most experts writing about psychological first aid are at pains to say that there is not a wide basis of research findings from which to find consensus about the best type of support after a disaster, most medical and disaster response experts consider the psychological first aid framework to contain the, quote, best intervention practices, unquote, based, as I said earlier, on the 5 principles. Principle number 1 is promoting a sense of safety. It seems self-evident that a number 1 goal in reducing trauma is to help a survivor or a disaster-affected individual to relative safety. And yet there are several angles to this issue. An important consideration is that of restoring the protective shield. Now, this means dealing with both the objective reality of safety, that is, the person is really out of danger, but also the person's felt sense that they are out of danger. That is, the subjective experience of safety. Traumatic events threaten to disrupt the protective shield, that ongoing sense of having a safe life that gives stability to life and underlies the development and maintenance of mental health. It's this that must be restored in first aid efforts. Another aspect of safety is that of reducing deeply embedded neurobiological reactions that come with fear and anxiety. The fight or flight reaction is profoundly hardwired into our human brains. It's an old survival response that is evoked with fear and anxiety. Reducing fear reduces the neurobiological reaction and may also reduce subsequent PTSD. A third consideration in restoring safety is that of correcting trauma-influenced views about the dangerousness of the world. Research has shown that holding a belief that the world is extremely dangerous is one of the main thought patterns that increases the risk of developing PTSD. So, promoting safety in these cases means breaking the linkages survivors have made in their minds between harmless images, people and things, and dangerous stimuli associated with the original traumatic event. As a psychological first aider, you also need to deal with safety in the social system, including safety from rumours and unbalanced information. Unfortunately, there is often little information to hand, especially as an event is unfolding. So the rumour mill runs rife, with people sharing horror stories and survivors thus being re-exposed to trauma. The intervention required of leaders is to present accurate, balanced and well-organised information to increase the perception of safety. Now finally, you must be attuned to safety challenges due to media presentation. Similarly, the quieting of the rumour machine. Psychological first aiders promoting safety must attempt to prevent the spread of fear in a community that can be endangered through government-issued and other messages delivered via the media. Messages must be well orchestrated to prevent the escalation of anxiety. But unfortunately, sometimes politicians are prone to exaggerate situations for their own political ends. Well, for instance, the stance of elect me and I'll protect you. These are the main issues concerning a sense of safety. And really, these words just allow for a comfortable segue into principle number 2, which is about promoting a sense of calm. There are several interventions that promote a sense of calm among survivors and trauma-affected people. Most of them involve some form of retraining to remind people that they are no longer in a danger zone and that their thoughts and feelings are not dangerous in the way that the original disaster was. Their stress reactions need to be normalised. That is with statements like, you are neither sick or crazy. You are having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And they need to be able to see that problems engendered by the crisis, often seen as just one big insoluble problem, floods, hurricanes, all these things. But they can be broken down into manageable bits and solved. Now, here's some of the techniques, and they include therapeutic grounding, breathing retraining, deep muscle relaxation, yoga, mindfulness meditation, stress inoculation training, normalization, positive emotion training, problem-focused coping, psychoeducation techniques, this is as part of a community outreach, anxiety management for mass consumption through the media and the internet, interventions to furnish needed resources. Principle number 3 says that we must promote a sense of self-efficacy. This wonderful term developed by Albert Bandura. Probably no construct or component of recovery has received as much attention in psychology as the importance of having some sense of control over positive outcomes, the belief in individuals that they are empowered to help themselves, to sort out problems. I mean, it's a major factor in them enacting the behaviours to do so. This sense of being empowered has two important aspects. Self-efficacy, where individuals believe that their actions are likely to lead to generally positive outcomes. They can do this through regulating their thoughts, their emotions, and their behaviour. And there's collective efficacy, the sense that one belongs to a group that is likely to achieve positive outcomes. The achievement of efficacy has some interesting twists and turns. So let's look at these as a way of understanding which interventions might work to promote this all-important characteristic. Survivors must be helped to avoid spreading incompetency, lack of self-efficacy. Let's say you survived the horrible disaster. Let's call it extreme flooding that I posed at the start of the talk. Now, you and your family are intact, but with almost no possessions. All credit cards plus other forms of identification were swept away in the floods. You know that you will need these to re-establish your life. I mean, even to lease a place while decisions are being made about how to replace your house. But you feel so overwhelmed by events that you can't think of what cards you had in what wallet. Goodness gracious, let alone how to replace them. You assume that this is just a temporary situation brought on by the shock, and you'll soon feel better and more able to complete these tasks. As the weeks go by, however, you come to the unfortunate realisation that just the opposite is happening. You're experiencing a sense of can't do it in just about everything, not only flood-related tasks, but in all areas of your life. If this is happening, you're experiencing spreading incompetency. Moreover, you used to have pride in your little community and its can-do attitude. But since the flood, it seems that the whole community has gotten bogged down in endless red tape. Everyone's in the same boat as you, so nothing seems to be happening. Going from your empowered former selves to these sort of sadly shrunken individual and community that you've become, what you see in the mirror and around you now is a discouraging experience. In short, you've lost your sense of both personal and collective efficacy, and restoring it is hard. But this is one of the primary tasks of psychological first aid. These major points need to be kept in mind in order to enhance survivors' damaged sense of empowerment and self-efficacy. So 1, self-efficacy cannot occur in a vacuum. It must happen in collaboration with concerned parties when large-scale problems beyond the reach of any single individual are to be solved. 2, a family must be strengthened to build efficacy in the community, as it is an important source of the social capital, and also the main place from which traumatised survivors will initially draw support and mental health care. 3, self and collective efficacy require the knowing of certain behaviours and skills. It's important to have a belief in one's capacity to solve problems. But if this isn't backed up by some basic skills at problem solving, the belief can collapse fairly quickly. If there's reasonable evidence of potential risk, it's useful to practice situations that might come up to build skills even before the disaster hits. This can happen even in the short term when an impending disaster, as can happen with floods, can be known. For empowerment without resources is counterproductive. No matter how strong the self-belief of an individual or a community, if there are not resources available to act with or on people, they feel demoralised and recovery is delayed. Principle number 4 is about promoting connectedness. An internet search of social support yields thousands of articles on the importance of social support for people in distress. This is because social support and social connectedness enhances opportunities to find out information essential to disaster response. It provides opportunities for problem solving, emotional understanding, and acceptance. It increases sharing and processing of traumatic experiences. And it helps to normalize reactions and experiences. It engenders mutual instruction about coping. And all of this can lead to the community efficacy that I've just been discussing. There's just one problem. There is very little empirical evidence on how to translate these validated principles into a psychological first aid intervention. So providers of psychological first aid are called upon to get creative about how to enact this principle. It's important, though, because here are some glitches that can happen if there is no social support or poor social support. One really important one is this lack of connectedness. It breeds trauma reaction. In the wake of the 9/11 attack and the collapse of the Twin Towers in New York, and also following terrorist attacks in Israel, one of the most common coping responses was to identify and link with loved ones. When connections with loved ones were delayed because the London bombings, you remember those, there was increased incidence of subsequent trauma. And research on disasters and terrorist attacks in countries as disparate as the United States, Israel, Mexico, Palestine, Turkey, Bosnia, all show that social support is related to better emotional well-being and recovering following mass trauma. However, it is important to note that not all support is created equal. Support can deteriorate quickly. As with funerals, there is often an outpouring of assistance, support and comfort when a disaster affects a community. Survivors' psychological distress is mitigated by the expressions of concern and the helping that they receive. The reality for most social supporters, however, is that at some stage, they need to get on with their own lives, and they cannot realistically continue to offer support at the same level. So when the survivor, maybe still mired in grief and shock, needs to receive continuing support, there's a mismatch where it requires further adjustment on the part of the survivor to cope with the social support leaving. Not all support is supportive. This is a difficult one because sometimes so-called supporters, in fact, can undermine survivors' recovery through minimizing their problems and needs, holding unrealistic expectations about recovery, giving invalidated messages, blaming the affected person. This can be particularly detrimental to a person's efforts to come back to normal. I mean, obviously it's crucial to identify early on who is receiving or likely to receive such support, or who, such as socially isolated people, may have poor support systems. But similarly, it will be difficult to make interventions connecting people to support systems when the community that those systems were part of have been evacuated or destroyed in the disaster. Intervention in these cases should be a priority. Religious, ethnic, and tribal divisions become more salient when resources are scarce. Disasters, and terrorists even, don't just happen where the communities are perfect. They can occur in areas where long before the disaster there were schisms in the community according to their religious, their racial, ethnic, social, tribal lines, the difficulties that occur between people. Where in good times a subpopulation in a community may be able to tolerate another group. The threats of violence, death, and the concomitant loss of resources from a disaster can result in groups becoming more suspicious of one another and less tolerant. This means that just when extra social support is needed, less is available. Stephen Hobful and his colleagues found that during a period of high terrorist activity, both Jews and Arabs became more xenophobic, and as their PTSD increased especially. Overall, despite the research gap, experts agree that there is enough experiential evidence from the post-9/11 environment to declare that promoting connectedness after disaster and terrorist activity is a best practice intervention. The fifth principle of psychological first aid is that of promoting hope. There's really quite a lot of definition, controversy about what hope means, how we define it. But regardless of this, it's reasonable to think of hope as related to a person's sense that things will improve, both within themselves and in what becomes available to them. On that sort of rather generalised basis, let's look at the importance of hope. There's a saying that in a mass disaster, hope is one of the first victims. Mass trauma is often accompanied by a sense that one's view of the world has been completely shattered and that the future has been shortened. There is a feeling that all is lost. Yet those who remain optimistic are likely to have better outcomes after experiencing mass trauma because they can maintain a reasonable hope for the future. So what can psychological first aiders do to promote hope? One way is to use CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, and positive psychology. When some individuals experience loss, they exaggerate their personal responsibility, believing wrongly that what happened perhaps was their fault. Therapies can help to create the most hope for those using things such as CBT to help people reduce such irrational beliefs. In addition, the learned optimism and positive psychology model attempts to identify strengths in people at risk and amplify them. In their strength-building activity, positive psychologists concentrate on hope and show survivor clients how to dispute the catastrophic and exaggerated thinking that would otherwise undermine hope. Another technique to install hope is that of normalizing. As with promoting calming, normalizing interventions help people to understand that their reactions are predictable, normal responses to an abnormal situation. An often effective normalizing remark is to indicate to survivors and disaster affected that most people recover on their own, without additional mental health interventions. This in itself instills hope, as the affected person can then counter thoughts such as, I'm inadequate, or my reactions are a sign that I can't take it. Similarly, survivors retain hope better when we help them decatastrophize. An intervention component that is crucial to preserving and restoring hope, decatastrophizing can help counter negative thought patterns. Many people catastrophize in order to prepare for the worst. While doing this can have some adaptive sense in some cases, it really more often leads to a failure to cope. The better option is to envision a realistic, challenging outcome. For instance, it will take some time to rebuild my house, but I can, rather than I'll never own a home again. And finally, community-level interventions foster hope by building social ecological resilience. An important determinant of communities' capacity for recovering from disaster is how well they can mobilise assets, networks and social capital, both to prepare for coming disasters and to recover from those which have already occurred. Different segments of the community which tend to have a leadership role, like churches, schools, community centres, can be instrumental in helping people to set positive goals, build strengths, and also provide a place to tell their story. The grand advantage of community-inspired initiatives is that they can implement hope-building interventions such as community-organised cleanups, home visits, blood drives. That's always something that's necessary. And other needed initiatives that involve community members who would otherwise feel like the problems were too big for one person to tackle alone. So So there we have it. A simple framework for action involving the promotion of safety, calm, empowerment, connectedness, and hope. Yet not all survivors will react the same to these interventions. We need to ask, who is at greatest risk for traumatic reaction? Often psychological first aid field guides try to alert volunteers to the many factors and classes of individuals which carry a higher probability of mental problems after a disaster. Commonly included on the factor lists are those that have been exposed longer or to greater magnitude disasters, those who have been exposed firsthand to extreme life threat, or those that have repeated threatening experiences, those who have been in a high degree of personal danger, and those who have been acquainted with victims who have died. Similarly, those who have mental health issues beforehand, either personally or in their families, those who come from cultural backgrounds which respond poorly to adversity, and perhaps even those who have had recent tragedies or disruption to their lives and communities. They're all at greater risk for traumatic reaction. Having to deal with media interference doesn't help much either. In addition to the above situation factors, there are individuals that are at special risk after a disaster, and some of these include children, especially those separated from parents and caregivers, those who have been injured, those who have multiple relocations and displacements, medically frail children and adults, those with serious mental illness, those with physical disabilities, illness, or sensory deficits, adolescents who may be risk takers, adolescents and adults with substance abuse problems, pregnant women, mothers with babies and small children. Disaster response personnel, we must never forget them. Those with significant loss of possessions, for example, home, pets, family, memorabilia. All these things are very important and very difficult. And these are the ones that we want to particularly look out for post-disaster, as they're less likely to come through with resilience. But let's turn to that question and ask, after the disaster, who survives better? In recent years, many disaster response experts and mental health researchers have switched their focus from looking exclusively at the at-risk populations in the aftermath of an emergency to asking, what are the protective factors? What situations, experiences, or personal traits help people to come through a traumatic incident more resiliently? And here are some of the factors negatively correlated with PTSD and other post-disaster mental disorders. They help protect against trauma response. If you have an optimistic outlook and positive expectations. If you have coping skills gained from a previous distressing event or experience. If you receive good social support from others. If you possess emotional stability. If you've been a disaster worker in environments that are less horror-filled and are more rewarding. If you've had relatively light loss of resources. If you've been provided with basic resources, food, shelter, emotion, and support early on. If you have a strong moral belief system or spiritual holding. If you're able to return to normal life with a there's reduced disruption, relatively sooner than others, so there still are some things you can return to. If you have a strong sense of cultural, racial identity, all these things, very important and very helpful. Finally, we want to know, if someone does end up being traumatised, what does a post-incident stress reaction look like? So looking for symptoms of trauma in the wake of a disaster is different from gauging client reactions in the calm confines of a therapy room. I mean, every emergency of traumatic experience is unique. And so there's a myriad of reactions that survivors have. But the World Health Organization notes that if you see any of these stress reactions, this is of concern. Physical symptoms. For example, shaking, headaches, feeling very tired, loss of appetite, aches and pains, crying, sadness, depressed mood and grief, showing anxiety and fear, being on guard or jumpy. You might have heard the term hypervigilance we describe for that. Worrying that something really bad is going to happen, that negative attitude to the future. Insomnia or nightmares, flashbacks or scene from the disaster coming back intrusively to mind, to these early PTSD symptoms. Irritability and anger, impulsiveness, especially you see this in adolescents who may take unwanted risks or have unwanted sort of ways to change things. Guilt or shame, for example, having survived and for not having helped save others. Confused emotionally, numb or feeling unreal, in a sort of a daze, appearing withdrawn, being very still, not responding to others, not speaking at all, being very shut down, and disorientation. For example, not knowing their name, where they're from, what happened, what the date is, what time frame you're in. Not being able to care for themselves or their children. For example, not eating or drinking, and not being able to make simple decisions in self-care. I want to note, it's vital to make sure that severely distressed people are not left alone. It may be up to you as the psychological first aider to try to keep them safe until the reaction passes or until you can find help from health personnel, local leaders, other community members in the area. Over the last half hour or so, I've been talking about a crucial component of modern disaster recovery: psychological first aid for survivors and trauma-exposed people. I've defined it. I've talked about why we need it. We've looked fairly extensively at the 5 principles, promoting safety, calmness, self-efficacy, connectedness, and hope, which are the foundations of psychological first aid, no matter the particular circumstances in which it's delivered. I identified the factors and the groups which are at greater risk, and the factors which tend to help people survive better. Of course, it's imperative for you, if you will be volunteering at a disaster scene, to recognise the symptoms of stress reaction, so I named the chief ones that you might see. In the next psychological first aid video, we talk about looking at the 8 actions which spring from these core principles, and also discuss 5 areas in which you should have competency if you are thinking of entering the field. In the same vein, we assess how ready you might be to do field work. Stay with us. There's a lot to know, yeah, sure. But if you take these concepts on board, the positive impact you may have is immeasurable.